Have you ever wondered why a man only begins to see her clearly once she's gone? It's not because she changed, not suddenly. It's because the mirror he used to avoid, her silence, her radiance, her rising boundaries, has shattered in her absence. And what is left behind, in that vast, echoing space she once filled, is not merely longing, it's confrontation with himself, with the shadow he spent his whole life refusing to face. She didn't leave in rage. She vanished in a deeper way, a soft disappearance, one that doesn't slam the door or scream her pain. She simply stops trying to be understood in a place where no one ever truly listened. She walks away not because she no longer cares, but because her spirit grew too sacred to beg, and that is the vanishing that rattles the masculine soul awake. When a woman vanishes, it is not the woman who disappears. It is the illusion he held of her that dies, the illusion he sculpted from fragments of his ego, the version of her that fit neatly inside his comfort, inside his projected ideals. But the real woman, the one who once offered him the sacred fire of intimacy, of emotional alchemy, was never truly seen. She was interpreted, possessed, diluted, and so, when she goes, she leaves more than silence behind. She leaves the void, that cold place where his own unconscious waits for him, the parts of him that were hidden behind control, detachment, arrogance, now rise to meet him in her absence. This is the moment Carl Jung spoke of, not with romantic language, but with mythological truth. The anima, his feminine unconscious, once lived through her, and now, denied of the external muse, he must encounter her within. But he is not ready. You see, most men are not taught to see a woman as her own cosmos. They are taught to see her as reflection, reward, or refuge. They do not know the feminine as storm and stillness, as mirror and mystery. They crave her warmth, but run from her fire. They want her devotion, but fear her depth. So he reaches out, but finds only memory. He calls, but no voice returns. Because when she vanishes, she doesn't just withdraw her body, she reclaims her soul. And in doing so, she no longer serves as a projection screen for his shadow. She is no longer the container for his unprocessed wounds. She no longer wears the masks he assigned her: caretaker, forgiver, emotional laborer, savior. She is now sovereign. And in this severance, his shadow awakens. What is the shadow? It is the unseen man within the man, the boy who never cried, the partner who could never say, "I am afraid to lose you," the man who felt powerful in dismissiveness because vulnerability was never safe. The shadow is not evil, it is unloved, and she, through her leaving, becomes the key that unlocks it, but only if he dares to look. You see, most women don't vanish as punishment, they vanish as protection, not from him, but from the parts of themselves they were silencing just to stay. From the parts of themselves they buried to remain likable, available, digestible. When she leaves, it is an act of remembering. She gathers the fragments of her fractured self and begins the long, sacred walk back to her own center. And while he may confuse this with betrayal, it is, in truth, a sacred invitation. Not for reconciliation, but for revelation. But only a few will understand. Some men will call her cold, others will chase her ghost, not realizing it was their own soul they were starving for all along. And some, just a rare few, will sit in the ruin of her absence, not with anger, but with reverence. These are the men who begin to see. And to the woman, perhaps you, who has walked away with quiet, holy courage, do not doubt the fire of your absence. It is not abandonment, it is initiation, not into loneliness, but into self-possession. The woman who leaves without hatred leaves with her dignity intact, and in doing so, she becomes unforgettable. Because the woman who vanishes doesn't become invisible, she becomes inevitable. In the echo of her footsteps, something ancient stirs within him, a haunting not of her presence, but of all he refused to feel while she was near. And now, alone with his own silence, he begins to hear what he spent years drowning in distraction. Her voice lingers, not in sound, but in the places she touched in him that no other ever dared to enter. The places that once felt too vulnerable, too raw, too real. Now, without her, those places ache, not with regret, but with revelation. Because her love was never shallow. It was a sacred mirror, a depth that threatened the fragile scaffolding of the identity he wore like armor. She didn't just offer affection, she offered transformation. But he mistook her depth for drama, her intuition for insecurity, her boundaries for rejection, and so she vanished, not to punish him, but to preserve herself. You see, the woman who disappears in stillness has already screamed 1,000 silent screams. She has already pleaded in subtle glances, in soft questions that begged for connection, in long nights where her body was held but her soul left untouched. And still, he didn't see her. Why? Because his ego wasn't ready to be undone. Jung teaches us that the feminine, when truly encountered, dissolves the masculine's illusions. She pulls him into the underworld, not to weaken him, but to make him whole. But wholeness demands destruction, of false certainty, of emotional repression, of the performance he mistook for power, and he wasn't ready. So now, her absence becomes the alchemy. Now, with no more reflection to project onto, his illusions begin to crack. He sees that she wasn't too much, he was too empty, that she wasn't confusing, he lacked the language of feeling, that she wasn't asking for more, she was asking for real, and he wasn't ready. But now, alone, he begins to meet himself in the dark. He notices the way his anger was a mask for grief, how his detachment was a prison he built from childhood wounds, how he demanded her to shrink because he never learned to expand. And so the awakening begins. But this is not about him, this is about her, about the woman who stopped performing love to be loved, about the woman who said no, not in resentment, but in rebirth, about the woman who chose to disappoint others rather than betray herself. Her silence now sings with truth, because when a woman vanishes from a man's life, she enters her own myth. She walks into the forest, not to be found, but to find herself. She unhooks from the narratives written for her. Be nice, be patient, be soft. She becomes her own author, and she writes in blood, not ink. Because this reclamation is not poetic, it's painful. It is sitting in the void without reaching back. It is allowing the tears to come without shame. It is choosing stillness over survival mode. It is no longer performing femininity for validation, but embodying it in full, sacred rage and radiant peace. And slowly, the mask falls from her own face too, the mask that smiled through disappointment, the mask that said, "It's fine," when it never was, the mask that made herself smaller to make him feel big. She is no longer interested in being understood by those who refuse to see. She is no longer a shapeshifter bending to love. She becomes the mountain, still, unmoved, whole. And this is the truth so few are willing to speak. The feminine is not weak. She is not a balm for broken men. She is not a mother to the emotionally unavailable. She is not a rehab for the spiritually blind. She is the storm, the silence, the sacred ending. And the moment she chooses herself, not out of bitterness, but out of truth, she becomes a mirror too sharp for illusion. She becomes the woman no man forgets, not because she stayed, but because she left. Not because she begged to be chosen, but because she remembered she could choose herself. In the realm of her return to self, something exquisite begins to bloom, a sovereignty so quiet it roars. You won't see it in her eyes right away, because now her gaze no longer seeks recognition. It observes, it sees, it pierces, because she no longer views love as something to earn. She sees it as something that must meet her in depth, and if it cannot go there, it cannot stay. This is not the same woman who waited by the phone. This is not the same woman who softened her voice so he wouldn't feel threatened. This is not the same woman who apologized for her intuition or laughed at jokes that cut her spirit. This woman has died. And in her place stands someone far more dangerous, because she is free, not cold, not hard, but liberated from the need to explain her value to those who refuse to cherish it when it stood in front of them in full bloom. The masculine will feel this shift, not in words, but in the way she no longer offers access to her energy without reverence. He will notice it when he tries to return, to rekindle, to reconnect, not out of depth, but out of nostalgia, and finds a door that no longer exists. Because the woman who vanishes and does the work doesn't just disappear from his life. She disappears from the version of herself that tolerated the crumbs of his affection. She has buried that former self in sacred soil, and something holy rises in its place. This is what men rarely understand. Her leaving is not abandonment. It is the moment the contract dissolves, the silent contract she signed in girlhood, the one that said, if I am good enough, soft enough, giving enough, he will choose me. But now she sees that the only one who needs to choose her is her. Do you know how many women carry centuries of emotional labor in their bones? How many are taught to be the better person while being slowly emptied by men who never learned to feel? How many have confused being needed with being loved? But now she sees, and once she sees, she cannot unsee. His shadow may awaken, yes. He may sit in the rubble of his projections and begin to feel the tremors of his own unmet grief. But this is not her responsibility to fix. Her healing is not his redemption. Her silence is not a cliffhanger in his story. It is the climax of her own. So many women return too early, out of guilt, out of loneliness, out of hope that maybe this time, if they just explain it differently, cry a little softer, beg a little quieter, he will finally understand. But not this woman, not anymore. Because now she knows when a man truly sees her, he doesn't need a breakdown to recognize her worth. He doesn't need her absence to respect her presence. He doesn't need to lose her to begin the work. He chooses the work while she's still there, because he honors her as a mirror, not as a maid for his emotional mess. But the man who only begins the work after she's gone, he is not her enemy. He is simply late, too late for her, but right on time for himself. And that's the gift. The rupture her vanishing brings is not a punishment, it is a mirror, and what he does with it, what he faces in the dead of night when her warmth no longer shields him from his emptiness, that is his journey. That is where his anima lives now, within. If he's brave, he'll meet her there, not in another woman, not in performance, but in the sacred silence of inner confrontation. In the dismantling of his superiority, his detachment, his inability to receive love without suspicion, in the graveyard of the emotional selves he buried. And maybe one day he'll thank her, not to get her back, but because losing her made him face what no one else ever dared to show him, himself. But she won't be waiting for his awakening. She will already be far beyond the place where men return with late apologies. She will be sipping tea in a garden she built with her own hands. She will be surrounded by peace so profound, chaos no longer tempts her. She will smile, not with bitterness, but with knowing, because she didn't just walk away, she walked home. Now, in the quiet bloom of her becoming, there is no longer a hunger to be understood. She has stopped bleeding for those who mistook her depth for drama, who turned away from her tears as though emotions were something to be managed, not honored. Her silence is not a pause, it is an emancipation. It is the sound of chains breaking in the psyche of a lineage of women before her whispering, finally she remembered. She remembered what it means to belong to herself. Gone is the girl who confused intensity with intimacy. Gone is the woman who interpreted inconsistency as challenge, who made excuses for coldness and called it mystery. Gone is the ache for validation from a man who could not meet her at eye level because he was still hiding behind masks of pride and fear. In her place, a woman has emerged who no longer walled. Walks into rooms hoping to be chosen. She arrives already chosen by herself, and now the man who once possessed her presence like an afterthought finds himself haunted, not by her body, but by her absence. Because her absence isn't empty, it is full. full of all the things she withheld in order to be palatable, full of the radiance she dimmed so he wouldn't feel small, full of the fire she tamed in order to keep the peace. Now, that fullness lives somewhere he can't reach, because it no longer belongs to his world, it belongs to hers. This is the part men don't understand about women like her. She wasn't asking for too much. She was asking for the sacred bare minimum: emotional presence, respect, reverence, honesty. But in a world where stoicism is confused with emotional repression and affection is rationed like currency, she was told to be grateful for scraps. But she learned. She learned that not everyone deserves her softness, that love is not about convincing someone to rise, that chemistry without consciousness is just another version of chaos. And most of all, she learned that love that costs you your self-worth is not love, it is self-abandonment in disguise. And now she chooses differently, not with pride, but with power, the quiet kind, the kind that no longer needs to argue, explain, or prove, the kind that knows, if you cannot meet me in truth, you will not meet me at all. And somewhere, perhaps sitting alone in the dim light of his own unraveling, a man begins to remember. He remembers the way her eyes held him when he was too ashamed to speak. He remembers the way her body softened when he felt most unworthy. He remembers how her silence once meant disappointment, not indifference. And he remembers that her leaving was not sudden. It was 1,000 tiny deaths. The ignored texts, the cancelled plans, the cold shoulder after his outbursts. She stayed through it all until she realized she was vanishing inside her own life. And so she did the only thing a woman can do when the cost becomes too high. She disappeared. But not in bitterness, in truth. In the truth that she was never meant to be the crutch for his unhealed masculinity. She was meant to be a partner, not a patch. And now, having left, she has become something even more rare than a lover. She has become whole. And in that wholeness, her aura changes. No longer is she magnetized to the emotionally unavailable, to the man who flinches at real intimacy. Now she is a flame, not the kind that flickers in the wind, but the kind that burns clean through illusion. The kind of woman who doesn't seduce with manipulation, but with presence, with peace, with power that doesn't need to perform. And when she speaks now, she doesn't beg, she doesn't adjust. She states, she chooses, she commands without raising her voice. Because when you have returned from the underworld of self-abandonment, you come back fluent in the language of boundaries, and nothing is more powerful than a woman fluent in her no. The man who lost her may now feel something he's never fully allowed himself to feel before: shame, not the toxic kind that collapses the soul, but the holy kind, the kind that awakens repentance, not as a tactic, but as truth. Not to win her back, but to become worthy of someone like her, even if it's not her. But she is not watching, because she's too busy loving herself in the ways she begged others to love her. Too busy growing in the dark and blooming in places no man ever thought to look. Too busy writing a new story, one where her worth is not a plot twist, but the foundation. Now she moves through the world, not with the urgency of the unloved, but with the grace of the initiated. She no longer searches faces for recognition, nor does she tailor her edges to fit someone else's emptiness. She walks with a softness wrapped in iron, a woman forged in the fire of unreciprocated love, unmet need, and the sacred rage of being unheard for far too long. There is nothing fragile about her anymore. What once broke her has now become her initiation rite. She has passed through the dark forest of detachment, not as a victim, but as a mystic. Each tear shed in private now waters the garden she tends with fierce devotion. She no longer hopes someone will understand her. She understands herself, and that is enough. This is individuation. Carl Jung did not romanticize this process. He knew it meant death before rebirth. It meant stripping away the false self, the persona she wore to survive, to reveal what was always there beneath the masks, the wild, the sacred, the self-possessed feminine. a woman not born of approval, but of fire and truth. And now, the men who once overlooked her don't even recognize her anymore. They sense the shift before they understand it. They feel the space around her change. She no longer leans in. She no longer explains herself. She no longer accepts being someone's emotional storage unit. She becomes unreachable to the frequency of the unhealed. And in doing so, she becomes deeply magnetic to those who have done the same work. Because true connection can only happen between two whole people, not a healer and the wounded, but two sovereign souls choosing to meet. She no longer wants potential. She wants presence. She no longer wants promises. She wants pattern. She no longer wants apologies. She wants alignment. And so, the man who feels her absence may begin his own descent, not for her, but for himself. This is the awakening that only loss can spark. The realization that to be loved by a woman who knows herself is to be seen, and being seen means being exposed. Can he stand naked in her light? Can he withstand the silence of her leaving long enough to face his own reflection? Can he sit with the grief not as punishment, but as a portal? Most will distract. Some will deny. A few will descend and rise. But by the time he reaches that sacred threshold, he may discover she no longer resides where he left her. Because the woman who vanishes is never standing still. She is evolving. Her absence is not a space waiting to be refilled. It is a new land, terra incognita, where only the initiated may enter. Not those who need her, but those who can honor her. And what of the woman? She is not hardened by what happened. She is refined. Her love is no longer a gift handed over without discernment. It is a temple. Entry requires reverence, honesty, and depth. She does not seek forever. She seeks real. And if real is fleeting, she would rather hold it for a moment than endure counterfeit for a lifetime. She no longer fears solitude. Solitude is now her sanctuary. And in this sanctuary, something divine takes root. A joy that is not performative, a beauty that doesn't require a witness, a freedom that cannot be bought with closeness. She has made peace with being misunderstood, with being too much, with walking away. She no longer needs to be anyone's muse. She is her own myth. And in the sacred aftermath of her disappearance, she is not looking back, not out of pride, but because the road ahead is hers to walk, not his to interrupt, not society's to dictate. She moves now in rhythm with something older than time, the voice within her, the knowing, the still small voice that says, "You were never